Well, I'm not going to sing because otherwise we'd have to burn that tape. At least my part of it. But I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say. I think that in many ways it would be better to not have ever met you than under these circumstances. Even though you seem like wonderful people, and I think that we're all better from having met you, it's hard to meet people under these circumstances of having lost somebody. You know, in Colorado, which is where I started organizing when I was 15, when I moved to Texas. But I left for a while and I did other things, and won't go through all of that. But through organizing in Texas, I was able to meet a lot of families of victims of police brutality. Many people, when they think of Denver, and I'm not here to really talk about Denver, Colorado, but sometimes if we've never been to a place and we've never experienced the circumstances that people there live under, what we know of it is what we see in the media. And so when you think of Colorado and Denver, you think of the mountains, snow-capped hills and skiing and winter sports and things of that nature. You don't think of the fact that the majority of people in the city are actually people of color, or that it had the highest incidences of police shooting around the country. You don't think about Denver in that way. And yes, the mountains are pretty. You can look west and you can see the snow-capped mountains, and that's very nice. And the Rocky Mountains have the largest system of 14ers in the country. If you like hiking on the mountains, if that means anything to you. And it's nice to retreat in the hills and to be up there and see them up close. But the same conditions that people face in the South Bronx, in Brownsville, and Harlem, and Oakland, California, and New Orleans, Louisiana, they exist in Denver, Colorado. And so, because of that, I was able to work with and meet a lot of families, and the one that sticks with me the most is the family of Paul Childs, who was a 15-year-old mentally disabled young boy. And Paul liked to go to his uncle's, and he would like to go by himself, even though he would get lost, and he only made it to his uncle's house once by himself. And every time he'd get lost, he'd call the police and say, "My name is Paul Childs, can you help me get home?" There were 50 calls like that of him calling, and he wanted to be a police officer. It would have never have been able to be one, but he wanted to be one. He looked up to him. They were his heroes. And so one week, he went on this journey by himself. And Denver actually has a pretty good mass transit system. I would say that about it. Except for the fact that over the years, what they've been able to do is privatize it and beat back the workers. And there was a bus strike there, but Denver is not like New York. It wasn't able to shut down the city, and 50% of mass transit is actually privatized, so they were able to move things around. But he was able to get to his uncle's. And his uncle was actually getting ready to leave the house, and he heard the doorbell ring, and he opens the door, and Paul Childs said, "Uncle, I made it." He was 15. And I worked at the school he worked at, East High School, and the teachers would talk about him. But the week after that, he wanted to go, and it was a Sunday, and he got agitated. Someone in his condition gets agitated because they don't understand things that well. And in his agitation, he took out a butter knife from the drawer. And his mother and sister weren't afraid of him. They were more afraid of what he might do to himself. And so they called the police. And James Turney shows up. And his condition, when you were yelling at him, he doesn't really understand. He didn't understand what you would be saying to him. He could not comprehend it, what you were saying. And so he was behind a screen door. The cop was 15 feet away, was yelling at him. He didn't really understand it, and he shot him 4 times in his chest. His name was James Turney. He had been fired as a cop in another place, and the week prior to that, he had threatened to kill his mother-in-law. And he had also participated in the murder of a hearing-impaired young black man named Greg Smith, who was 18, who was shot on the steps. And he was put on desk duty, and nothing else happened to him. I think it's important for us to understand. You see, a lot of times, and people, sometimes good people who are confused want to be cops. They think, I'm going to help people who are in trouble. And there's many contradictions in society. That happens sometimes. I'm going to help people, and I'm going to help clean up my neighborhood. And first we have to look at where crime actually comes from. You can't talk about antisocial behavior in an antisocial society, number one. Right? Society is built off of crime, legalized crime. So some good people, and my brother wanted to be a cop. And I said to him simply, what are you going to do when you come to a protest, when I'm at a protest and you were called to police a protest and I'm there and the cops attack? Are you going to break my skull with your baton? He said, I'm going to change that. I said, you're not the first person to go into the system and think you're going to change it. What happens is you get changed in the process. You can't change it from within. They've had many people who have thought well of themselves enough to think that's going to happen. It's not set up that way. You have to tear it down. But so the whole idea of there just being some rogue cops and there are some nice people, we have to dispense of that, and we have to look at what the primary function is of police in U.S. society. Go all the way back to the patty rollers, who were the first police. They were the slave catchers. Their job was to maintain the status quo, which was a slave society. The police in bourgeois or capitalist society, their job is to maintain the status quo, to be in between you and those who own the majority of society through their wealth. That is what their job is. And so if you go to a picket line of workers who are striking against a company, the cops might say, we're here to keep order. What they're really there to do is to keep the workers from seizing that factory. I was able to go to Republic Windows and Doors when that great momentous event happened, when they seized that plant and stopped the bosses from taking the equipment out of there. And they were under threat of the police coming in there and arresting them, even though the bosses were in violation of the WARN Act. They were the ones who committed the crime. The sweat and blood and tears those workers put into building that company means that they owned it. They had a right to their jobs and a right to everything in there and a right to the wealth that they created. But it ain't the bosses who were under threat of arrest. It was the workers. Because that's the function of police in U.S. society. And the reality is that we're getting ready to vote in, how many days from now? It's like a week and a half or something like that. You know, no matter how you might feel, what lever you're going to pull, the day after the elections, or the day after whoever wins takes, whoever they are, they take office in the Congress or they take presidential office, nothing will have changed. The same brutal, repressive, exploitative society will exist after having pulled that lever. Nothing that we have ever won has been won through pulling a lever. We didn't get the right to vote by voting for it. We got the right to vote by fighting and dying for it. And so, how can we really win? And when I talk about justice, you see, I was talking to the brother Messiah Rhodes, who is organizing unemployed workers in Brooklyn, and we should give him a round of applause. And that's hard work, and yeah, stand up, man. You see, one of the hardest things about organizing unemployed people is because we have been made virtually invisible in this society. They don't have unemployment lines anymore. You go and you register for unemployment over the phone or through the internet. So it's invisible. People who are starving are invisible. We don't relate to one another through our shared conditions and experiences anymore. We are ashamed of them. People are ashamed that they can't feed themselves and their family, and they shouldn't be, because they have not done anything wrong. And so part of organizing people, when we talk about politically organizing people, we have to also be cognizant of we need to take care of the cultural well-being of people. Because the culture of U.S. society is like degraded. It is this rotten ass culture. It is anti-people, it is anti-social. And we take that in. We are alienated from one another. and we are in competition with one another. So through struggle, we socialize people to think in a different way. To say, no, you haven't done anything wrong. And the only way that you can guarantee that you're going to be able to feed yourself and your family tomorrow is you fight for it. The only way you will guarantee yourself a right to a job is you have to fight for it. And what will that win us? You see, sometimes people come to the struggle because of a horrible act that they faced, because they lost a family member to a cop. Sometimes they come because a recreation center in their neighborhood was closed down. Sometimes they come because they fear losing their job. But there's something that happens through struggle. You remember what happened in Wisconsin. If you had paid attention to the whole history of Wisconsin, number one, Wisconsin in its history was a progressive state. It was the birthplace of public sector unionism, and it was the birthplace of the radical Republican Party. Not the one that we think of now, but the Republican Party that was pro-women and anti-slavery. And that has its contradictions, because you had the bankers and the industrialists who were part of that too, along with the people who were really against the system. It has contradictions, but if you go to Wisconsin now, it seems like it could be Arizona or Mississippi. It's very strange how that happened. So the attack against public sector workers and against the people of Wisconsin, it started in the Wisconsin corridor. Racine and Milwaukee. People were hit hard for years, and a lot of Wisconsin ignored it, or they bought into the racism that was used to justify the attacks on these workers. But something magical happened when Walker came in and he said, I'm just going to destroy unionism altogether. I'm going for the whole thing. People who may have had a whole lot of racist beliefs, and maybe they had them afterwards, but when the workers and the students marched in and seized that Capitol, it transformed people. Because struggle transforms you. You may come for one particular reason, but you leave out of it through seeing that it's the whole system that has to go. But how do we get there? What we have seen, and I'm going to wrap up this, what we have seen is over the past 30 years that the people that we thought were doing our bidding all along weren't in fact, and that this particular juncture in history, because of high technology, because of outsourcing, because of capitalism having outgrown the planet, all the things that were won through struggle are being taken away now. And quite frankly, they have no intention of giving them back. We see the growing pauperization all over from Greece, Italy, Spain to here, along with the super exploitative conditions that exist in the third world. And so you have workers in India, and you have workers in Nigeria, and workers all over the world who are in direct competition with workers in the developed world. For their very survival, it's a race to the bottom. So in this type of system, in this type of world order, what can we do? We have to first recognize and communicate to people that these people are put in place to not do our bidding but to maintain the system, the government, the politicians, and that we have to begin to think and erect a new order. We have to defend ourselves. Whether it is a person next door whose home is being foreclosed on, whether it is fighting for a stop sign in your neighborhood, or fighting to get the street lights working, fighting against school closures or against the privatization of schools, we have to see the commonality in our struggle, and we have to begin and fight for power. And it might start with fighting against police brutality. It might start there. It might start with demanding community control over the police. It might start with calling for the resignation of a certain police chief or the mayor, or the resignation of the entire city council. It might start there.
That's right.
But from there it will grow. It will grow in defense of our right to our schools and our right to an education. It will go to be general from something that is very specific, because these things aren't separated from one another. The brutality that we face is not separate from the harsh conditions that we face of starvation and degradation. They're not separate things. They are part and parcel of something much bigger. So when we talk about people's power assemblies, it means that basically we must begin to organize. And in the process of our organizing, we must begin to make the system itself ungovernable. Like they were able to do. You shut down a city council because they're not going to do anything any damn way unless they are in a great fear for what may happen if they don't. And that's what we have to do. And over time, our struggle for power rivals their system as it's set up. And people no longer go to the city council because they see the people's power assemblies as being the real representation of power and of people's needs and what they deserve in society. They will start to come to you, like in Baltimore. They don't call whatever thing has been said. They don't call the Internal Affairs Division when it comes to police brutality anymore. They call the Baltimore People's Assembly. That's how they found out about Anthony Anderson, who was picked up and slammed on his head and died as a result of his injury. And the cops lied and said he ingested drugs and he choked to death. It was through the Baltimore People's Assembly that they forced the city to release the autopsy report that showed that the cops, in fact, did kill him, and they changed it from an accidental death to homicide. It was struggle that won that. And it is struggle that will end this brutal system, because if we don't end the system, then we'll be here next year talking about the next murders. We'll be here next year talking about the cutbacks. We'll be here next year talking about all the harsh conditions that we face, and we probably will be. But I hope that when we come back next year and we're talking about this, we're actually talking about it in a much more fuller room. And we're talking about how to shut the city down, and we know that it's possible through experience. Just like they did in Oakland. Actually, it took me a while for it to register with me. We met in Oakland during the port shutdown. Oh, yeah. After that case of police brutality, they shut down the ports and they shut down the city of Oakland. That's where we need to go. And I think the way to get there is to build assemblies at every level, be they in neighborhoods, be they in cities, be they regional. Begin building these cities and make these people's power assemblies the representation of us fighting for our needs and our interests within U.S. society. Because that's the only way that we're going to win, is by seizing and taking power and destroying the old order and building something that is much more human on top of it. So all power to the people. Thank you. Oh, that's right. Seeing all of that, I forgot what I was really here to do. On November 10th, there is going to be a meeting here to discuss the people's power assemblies. Nothing is put in place, but we want to actually work with people in the community, no matter what community they are actually in, who see the need for a broad and comprehensive struggle, who want to begin to talk about how do we form, what does it look like, how can I go back to my community and organize and build these assemblies. We want to have that conversation here. So November 10th, which is a Saturday, 4 days after the election, it's talking about next steps. 2 weeks from today, we're going to be meeting here. I forgot what time it is.
What time is it?
Who knows? 2 o'clock. 2 to 5, or we can go 2 to midnight if you want to. If it's that serious of a conversation, sometimes we need to go that long and have like deliberative conversations and don't leave until we have things hammered out and hashed out. So we're inviting you to come back here on November 10th, which is a Saturday, from 2 to 5 or 2 to 12 or however long you want to be here. We'll feed you, make sure all those needs are taken care of. And we're going to talk about how can we make people's power assemblies real at every level and begin to reinvigorate the struggle that was started by Occupy Wall Street, you know, and push things forward. And so that's it. So thank you for being here. All power to the people.